Your source for everything paranormal. Para-X. Views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para-X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. Now, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Hey, merry meet everybody, and welcome to Stirring the Cauldron here on the Para-X Radio Network. The music you were just listening to was called The Shaman's Call, and there's a very good reason for that. My guest tonight is James Stovall, and also known as Shaman Jim. And James is an initiate in the shamanic tradition of Quero, and I think I'm pronouncing it close, who are the descendants of the Inca. They live on one of the most remote places in the Peruvian Andes, and James happens to live in Michigan, where he studies how these ancient mountain traditions reflect in the cold, deep waters of the Great Lakes. He and his wife Angi own the Wandering Owl, where he teaches classes and workshops and sells spiritually inspired arts from some of the best artists in Michigan. And he's also the host of the Jaguar and the Owl here on Para-X. And some of you have heard him, some of you haven't, but if you have any questions for James and you're here in the Para-X chat room, please send them over to me in private chat and I will pass them on. Welcome, James.
Thank you so much. Wow, that introduction sounds really impressive. I wonder who you're talking about. It couldn't possibly be me at this rate. So
you got to look over your shoulder. This is how it works. Whenever somebody does that, you just kind of look over the shoulder, look over the shoulder, and just say thank you. Yeah, Yeah,
Yeah,
that kind
that's
of.
about it. It sounds really impressive when someone else reads it out like that. That's
I
pretty
know.
neat.
I know. I've had the same experience. I'm going, no, no, they're lying. Don't believe them.
That's right.
Uh-huh. All right, so we've got a lot to talk about tonight. And one of the things that people sometimes get a little confused about here and there is what a shaman is. And if you had to describe what a shaman is to someone who hasn't got a clue, how would you define it?
Yeah, that's a really deep question. And like you're going to find when you go in various chat rooms and forums and web pages, I mean, that is a question that causes all kinds of arguments. So I'm going to have to approach it from a couple different ways, right?
Good, because we're stirring the cauldron. So be my guest.
Right. Exactly.
Bring it on.
The shorthand answer in some ways is that it's a shaman is a very specific term to a very specific people, the people that live in the far northern parts of Russia into Siberia and into the Arctic Circle. And so it's a term that was taken from them by anthropologists, and it's kind of used as a blanket term to describe a lot of different spiritual practitioners from all over the world that have and incorporate similar methods. So that's the short and very more scientific answer. But I think what people are usually kind of curious about is the practical answer. And the practical answer is that a shaman is someone who interacts with the spirits on behalf of humanity, be that their family, their village, or their region. So a shaman is a job title. There's not any religious dogma that is 100% shamanism. The shaman come from all different spiritual and religious backgrounds. It's really a job description. It's a task. And with that comes a lot of responsibility too, because you're going to get a lot of people that want to use that term for themselves, but they're not actually doing the work. And that's kind of where you can tell the difference, where you can separate the wheat from the chaff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know what? I've said this, and I know that you agree because you're really kind of into paganism in general. But you know, the practice that I practice is very similar to shamanism. There are so many similarities that paths definitely do cross, don't they?
Yeah, they sure do. And, you know, I started myself, my first interests were in paganism and Wicca. And over the years, hanging out with several of them, it's kind of funny because I realized that there are some key differences, but shamans have a lot in common with chaos magicians of all things, because chaos magicians, they look at what works, and a lot of that is very common in shamanism. There's such a thing as traditions and initiations that are handed down, don't get me wrong, and I personally feel that they're really important, but a lot of it just boils down to what works. Does it work? If it doesn't work, then we find a different way. We talk to a different spirit, or we try a different ritual. We approach things a different way. So yeah, there's a lot of similarity and overlap between like paganism, witchcraft, shamanism, and I think that's why shamanic and indigenous practices are they appeal so much to pagans and shamanic practitioners. And plus, you know, if you get into like the hardcore polytheists and that sort of thing, you got a lot of traditions that are trying to rebuild their core traditions, things that have been stamped out. And so they look at indigenous cultures and try to recreate in their own language what their ancestors might have lost.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the major similarities is that it's a nature-based thing, nature-based religion, whatever you want to call it, a respect for all sentient things. And that was kind of the first thing I thought, oh yeah, shamanism, they do what we do. You know, that's years ago is what I kind of put together. But yeah, it does go more. And it's interesting that you talk about chaos magic, because chaos magic is something that scares a lot of people, you know?
Sure.
Andre Vitamus, who's here on Para X, I mean, you talk to him, he's like the walking encyclopedia of this. And, and you know, I mean, I've had him on my show, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so stupid compared to him. I don't know anything because, you know, He's just, chaos magic is chaotic in my mind. But the similarities, basically, we're all pagans, right? Shamans, because in case people get that confused, pagan is an umbrella term too, just like shaman is, for everybody that just doesn't practice, the big three, organized religions. So I was doing a little bit of homework. I was challenged by your path. Is it Keros, or how do you pronounce it?
Kero
Okay.
traditions.
All right. So I did a little bit of homework, and I found out that they are said to be the last of the Incas and indigenous farmers and mystics that live in very high altitudes up in the Andes. And interestingly, up until the 1950s, they lived in relative isolation and had very little to do with the outside world, which probably was to their benefit. But the Quero shamans are credited with preserving and maintaining the healing knowledge, the ancient prophecies, the beliefs, and the tradition of the Inca, and the knowledge of civilizations which came before them, and this is all done by oral tradition. Right. And this is fascinating to me. And then it went on to say that over the years, they've selflessly shared their traditions and wisdom with seekers of knowledge from all corners of the world. So, because it's not, if you were like a Native American shaman, which is a lot more common about what we hear, it wouldn't be so interesting in the sense that now I've got to ask you what compelled you to seek out this particular path, because it is off the beaten path, basically.
Yeah, okay, so I'll give you the longer and more amusing version of the tale, I think, because so a lot of this started way back when in AOL chat room days, right?
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so
that's a long time ago.
Yeah, right. So I've been into paganism and witchcraft and that for a very long time. And so there used to be these forums called Ask a Witch, and I used to go on there and I would answer questions, because what I kept finding in a lot of these rooms was that people would have questions, and it was the same basic questions over and over again, unfortunately, but people, they all have a different starting point. And so I was one of the few people that would pretty much answer any question that came along, no matter how many times it came along. And the screen name I was using back in the AOL days was Two Snakes, right? And there was one other person in the chat room that would also answer questions without fail. And her screen name was Snake Willow. So we started getting in a conversation, and that turned out to be the woman that became my mentor, Mateo Empi. And she lived, as it turned out, not very far from me. So I started finding out more about her traditions and the paths that she followed. And once again, someone that has been into the occult scene for a long time, long time. And but she was attracted to the Peruvian traditions because of, as you said, they were relatively pure still. They were in a state where there hadn't been a lot of changes to them yet. And so she was attracted to them. And I immediately fell in love with that myself and wanted to pursue that myself. And I badgered her, and this is absolutely no lie. You can ask her about it. I became her first student because for 6 months I bothered her. Will you teach? Will you teach? Will you teach? Until finally she broke down and accepted me. And that's kind of what it takes sometimes.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Yes. Well,
but I was really attracted to that because, as you said, they were high up in the mountains. These are villages that survive at altitudes where some people would start thinking about using an oxygen bottle.
Yeah,
they're that high up in the mountains, and so they were really isolated. And one of the things with, and I throw this in there as well, a lot of the things with Native American traditions sometimes is that there's the cultural appropriation, right? The stealing, the theft of rituals and terms and that from indigenous peoples. And with the Quero, it was the fact that once they started opening up to the broader world, there was a weird thing that started to happen where they actually started to lose some of their own children to these practices. The children weren't as interested in being sheep herders or herders at these high altitudes where they could go down into the cities and find jobs easily. And so the elders made a very conscious decision spiritually to share with whoever came looking, whoever came with genuine intent to seek them. And so that was also an appeal to me, because I didn't have to feel like I was just mimicking something. It was something that was offered.
Right, right. You know, I was also reading that the Q'ero followed the shamanic way of seeking or seeing the divine in everything, whether it's a blossom or a river or a rock or an animal or indeed another person. So they treat everything and everyone with respect and reverence. And, you know, we were just a minute ago saying that that's kind of the pagan way too, but there are a lot of paths that don't do that, pagan paths, you know?
Right.
And so, because somebody will say, a rock, come on, you know, that kind of thing, or a bug. But it goes beyond respect for sentient beings. It goes to everything, because, all right, is the theory that everything has a soul, even something that's inanimate like a rock?
Right. That's correct. Everything has a soul. Everything has a spirit. And what's more, it's all connected and interconnected, like a vast tapestry. And you know, there's most of the time the Q'ero are going to refer to Wiracocha, which would be the Great Spirit, but the Wiracocha translates to essentially the foam of the ocean, and so that's how you think of it. Like if you're walking along a shore, and you see all those billions and billions of little tiny bubbles that come out of the ocean. That is us, and that's the stones and the tree people and everything else. We are all these little bubbles that are still part of that greater ocean.
Wow, and Reverend L. Newman's in the chat room, and if you can see this, she said there are songs in the stones. And I think that's
definitely
beautiful. I really think that's beautiful. I didn't think about it like that, but thanks,
that might be. I think maybe that is. Sort of where shamanism separates itself from paganism a little bit, because not all pagans are as animist as the shamanic folk are. They don't believe necessarily, like we might see in paganism, that people recognize that certain crystals have energy, or certain plants have an energy or something like that. Yeah. But to see them as distinct and individual beings that you have a relationship with sometimes is the point of separation.
Well, I had a guest on years ago who was very much into runes. And she said that each rune was alive.
Oh, definitely.
And there were people in the chat room that go, no, she's crazy. No, can't be. You know, I mean, we're talking about stones here, you know. But, yeah, it's such an open-minded type thing that if you have any qualms about things being the way you think they should be, or, you know, they're not. I mean, that's kind of the line that divides the pagans from, well, I'm using a bad term here, but pagans from the muggles in a way, because there is that open-mindedness of everything is possible. And I've said this 1,000 times before, but whereas most people live in the black and white, we live in the gray, because the gray is the area of all possibilities. And I'm thinking that's kind of the way you see it too. You know, not everything is just cut dry in black and white.
You know, I'll tell you one of the, and if the listeners take nothing else away from this show, I'll tell you the most useful thing I think that comes out of the Peruvian shamanism is that a lot of times in a lot of our spiritual paths, and you see this reflected in paganism and Christianity and everything else, we kind of get into this area where it's almost like a competition, right? It's a polarized nature where it's good versus evil, light versus dark. And in Peruvian shamanism, they don't use those terms. The terms that they would use are heavy and light. And really the way they frame it, and the way I found so helpful for reframing a lot of things that happen in people's lives, is it light for you to carry? Or is it heavy for you to carry? Is it a burden, or is it something that you carry with very little effort? And what's interesting is what's a burden for me might not be for you. Right. And what's a burden for you might not be for me. But it takes a lot of the value judgment out of it. It takes a lot of the conflict out of it. They're just different people can carry different things in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. And there's always the duality. People are always, oh, the dark side. Oh, the white side is good. The bright side. Right. But you can't, I mean, there is that duality. You can't have light without dark. You can't have good without bad. I mean,
Right.
it all kind of forms together. It's one big thing, like it or not, you know? I mean, there was something I saw on the internet the other day about don't be afraid of the dark, because that's when you shine the brightest, because, you know, it gives you time to think and it just opens you up and whatever. I mean, that's hard to explain to people that only see black and white. And I think as any kind of a teacher, it's very frustrating to deal with people that don't open up to the possibilities. Not,
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
they don't have to believe them. They don't have to embrace them, but they need to listen with an open mind and make up their own mind, instead of somebody telling you, well, no, there's no such thing as that. No, find out for yourself. That's
Right.
kind of, you know, where I kind of hang out in this. We've got some questions from the chat room,
All righty.
and so I want to get to those, and I've got a bunch of questions for you too. But the first question is, Ari is asking me to ask you about the female jaguar.
Okay. So a lot of the oh boy, there's a lot to condense down here. So there's in the Peruvian shamanism of the mountains, you find a lot of times there are several animals that come up the most common. The temptation there is to call them archetypes, but they're really not. But we're going to use that sometimes as a suitcase handle for carrying these things around. So these are great and powerful spirits, and they show up really common in Peruvian shamanism. And one would be the anaconda, one is the jaguar, one is the condor. And you see them in many different places. You'll see them, the artwork of them in many different places. And as I was taught, the jaguar has a couple different aspects. Now, once again, I don't know if this is a limitation on my part. I'm not sure I'm nuanced enough. I don't know if I am fine enough point to decide whether this is two separate spirits. I think it is. But we were always taught to work with the female aspect of the jaguar, because like there's heavy and light and that sort of thing, the jaguar tends to appear to us in a couple different ways. And the male tends to be very territorial and very aggressive, where the female is not. And this is actually even reflected way back when in Inca times. There are constellations, and the way the society itself was organized after patterns in the stars, and there was a jaguar period where the females were the landowners and the male men were seen as jaguars, but they kind of were ran out of the village because they couldn't be stable as a society with the men in charge. There's so many layers to it. It's really kind of trying to peel an onion. But the female jaguar, the spirit that we work with, is Otorongo. And Otorongo is a wonderful, beautiful creature that she helps us to set boundaries, and she helps us to be warriors. And the thing I like about her as a warrior aspect is they call her the fearless warrior. And it's because she's fearless because she has no enemies. And if you have no enemies, you've got nothing to fear. And it's not that there aren't people that challenge her. It's just that the decision is there, that she's strong enough in her boundaries where they're not enemies. They might just be opposing her, but they're not enemies.
It's, wait a minute, there's another question that just threw me completely off because I saw it come up. I'm fine. Where did it go? Okay. What is the hardest part of shamanism?
So the hardest part for me, I think, is that as I said, the shaman acts as a bridge in between the human world and the spirit world. So I think that the hardest part for me is sometimes, no matter what I want to do, no matter what would make my life better, I either have to go and try to make deals, to call on my allies, to do ceremony to help someone in the physical world, in my community, in my village, in the people that I care for. Or other times the reverse is true, to build those relationships, to make sure that they're strong and I can get the the help that I need. I have to set aside everything in my personal life, time with my family or anything else, to answer what those spirits demand of me.
Mm-hmm. And so when you're praying, I mean, we have the god and the goddess, and who do you pray to? Is there one god? Is it many? At
my core, as I said, in Peru, they would look at Huiracocha, the Great Spirit, which tends to be seen as one thing, but it's not defined enough. It's such a wide concept that it almost doesn't have a personality of its own, if that makes sense. It isn't until you get to a lower level, like Inti Taita, Father Son, that you have more of a personality there. But I am an old school polytheist, so I work with the deities of my ancestors too, Slavic deities, Norse deities, and so it's really hard for me to answer, because a lot of times, if I'm a polytheist or a monotheist, depends on who I'm serving. And I mean that really literally, because if I'm serving my spirits that I work with, I'm very polytheist. But there are times when my shamanic work means that I have to help somebody who is a hardcore monotheist or a Christian, which means that for those moments, while I'm doing that, I'm a monotheist.
Right. And I think we all have to be that way. We can't be singularly stuck to one thing, because there are just so many options out there. To put it in layman's terms, just tons and tons of options. One more question. Aria wants to know if there is any singing or instrument ritual in your form of shamanism. Yeah, certainly. There are sacred songs, and sometimes what I've seen used a lot in ritual tends to be bells, of all things. It's very interesting, because in the high mountains they're able to slip in and out of that sacred mindset so easily to do their shamanic work, that they don't necessarily need the drums and quite literally the bells and whistles like us lowlanders do sometimes. Right. And as a matter of fact, like when I do the Peruvian fire ceremony, we use a song that has been borrowed from the natives of the Pacific Northwest, because it's a great song and it feels right. It has a lot of power to it, but it's not a song from Peru, because in Peru they don't have that need to speak and talk like we do, so they don't need the songs quite the same way that we do. There's a question that just came up in the chat room. Cater says, I heard shamans get possessed by the spirit of the animals or something else. Are they aware of themselves during this time, or are they completely lost in the spirit?
Oh, that's going to depend as well. So it really depends on how strongly the spirit comes in. So like my co-host on the Jaguar and the Owl, they're Sarenth. So there's times when Odin comes and sits with him, or sits in him, I should say. And so there are times when Sarenth has a vague idea of what's going on, and there's other times where it's 15 minutes later and, oh, what happened? Somebody filled me in. And for good or for ill, I don't get possessed very easily. I do journey work very well, and I pick fights really well, but I don't get possessed very easily. And so it's come a lot of times in ritual that I end up being the one that kind of does that jaguar work and kind of guards the space and makes sure everybody else stays safe, because it's very difficult for a spirit to really jump in and take control of me like that. It does happen, though.
Yeah, why I can. Well, as long as we mention the Jaguar and the Owl, let's talk about it. Your show here on Para X. When is it? What's it all about? Talk about Sarenth, and Aria just put a note. How did you meet him? So let's start at the beginning.
Well, Jaguar and the Owl is every other Tuesday at 8 o'clock here on Para X. It alternates in between itself and Deeper Down the Rabbit Hole. What initially started happening was Andrea Vitimus had a show on at that time slot, and he started getting to the point where he had too many obligations, and so he asked me to come in, and we alternate shows. So we're every other Tuesday from each other.
You and Mr. Cass, yes.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And Sarenth, boy, I've been friends with Sarenth for a long time now. I can't even think about how long it's been. 12, 13, 14 years, somewhere in that range probably is my best guess. I met him very much by chance at a festival here in Michigan. And it was one of those things where, yeah, he seems like a decent fellow. And then just conversations keep increasing and going on and on. And over time, you just become like brothers. That's just how it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So what kind of things do you talk about on the show? Do you have guests? Do you guys talk amongst yourselves? How does it work?
We do
I know
a little
the answer,
bit of both.
But,
Yep. Yeah, we do a little bit of both. Some shows, we call them the catch-up shows, where we'll run through what's going on with us. We'll take a look at interesting news articles. We'll just whatever kind of stirs the conversation. We answer emails a lot because we do a lot of ancestor work. That's one of our big favorite topics is ancestor work. And so we get a lot of questions about that. And then other shows I have guests on. I've had some really Iksak Beery. I've had some really high-level guests on from time to time. I just did a really amazing interview this past Tuesday with Matthew Wood, who he and I talked an hour just about plant spirit medicine and how to connect to the plants. He's billed in most places as an herbalist. And then when you get him on the show, you start talking about the research he's done into old Southern folk medicine, root medicine, and Anishinaabe and other indigenous practices. And then then the truth comes out. And he starts talking. We talk about how he talks to the plant spirits, and they give him information that isn't necessarily in the books and things like that. And that was a great show. So we do a little bit of both.
That's great. I mean, it's interesting, and I know it's a very popular show, and you have, just by the number of people in chat right now who followed you in here tonight, you have a great audience.
Yeah, I always have a lot of fun with the chat room. There's times when the questions come in way too fast, and I can't even keep up with them. But I'm really glad that when people show up, it makes me really happy.
That's when you tell them to send it to you in private, because if you're going to go on the chat room and it starts scrolling, you're gone. Done.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you'll never find it again. I want to jump back for 1 second, because I'm going to be going back and forth here. But one thing that I was reading in your bio or somewhere, it said something about how do the ancient modern traditions of Kiro reflect in the deep, cold waters of the Great Lakes. And, one would think that they would be worlds apart, but apparently we're all in one world. So, yeah, tell us about that.
Well, okay, so yeah, it's really interesting because in the Kiro traditions, they work a lot with spirits of the land, especially so a large stone or a lake or a river will have a spirit to it. And in Peru, the biggest spirits that they work with are the mountains of the Andes. Obviously, there's these huge mountains that they are completely and totally surrounded with, and they're called the Apu. The Apu are the name of the spirits of these places. And so a lot of their traditions revolve around appeasing the Apu, talking to the Apu, getting favor from the Apu, and of course Mother Earth. Well, the way they envision the mountains is really interesting because they say that a mountain is a powerful star's spirit reflected on Earth. So a very tall mountain is the spirit of a very powerful star reflected on Earth, and that mountain is reaching up towards its star. So then we have the opposite, in a sense, here in Michigan, where we have these very deep, dark lakes. And it's not that they're running away from the star's energy necessarily, but they create a more reflective and inwardly turned space in some ways. Instead of, as a spiritual standpoint, from my perspective, a lot of times the lakes are dealing with a lot of underworld energy, with that stuff that's really deep and dark within us. And yet they still reflect the stars just as well sometimes. So, but, it's the contrast. It's that, as you said, that dark light, heavy light duality. Sort of thing. Duality, yes, exactly. And so it's been very interesting to see how those energies come across. And even the spirits of the lakes talk to me really well. The Great Lakes, we have a pretty good relationship. And so a lot of times I'll turn to both the mountains in Peru and to the lakes here at home. And what's really interesting about this practice too is so it is kind of deceptive sometimes when you look at a map, but if you look at a globe, you'll see that the west coast of South America, where the Andes Mountains are and where these traditions come from, is directly below Michigan. We are essentially straight. They are essentially straight down from us, and so there's a way that energy reflects that way too, which is interesting.
Wow. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought of that, but that's a very good point. I also mentioned that you own the Wandering Owl, and I think the first question though is, since you have owls in both your store and your show's name, what's the significance of owls? Are they a totem animal, or there's got to be a connection here, right?
It's actually a lot more superficial than that. It was the owl was named with inspiration from family input when we were trying to name the store, and the show reflects that I love the jaguar. She's one of the ones that walks closest with me, and the owl was to reflect the store's name and the show's name as well. So.
Well, okay, boo. There's this really wonderful story in there. All right.
Well, there kind of is. I mean, it's kind of funny because, here we are. We are a little tiny spiritual store, and we are, and I quite literally, in the city that claims itself as the birthplace of the Republican Party. So that gives you some idea of the kind of energy of this town that we're in. It's home to
run out on a rail or anything.
It's home to Michigan's first prison, and for many years, Michigan's largest prison. And yeah, so here we are, this little metaphysical shop, right? And so we were searching once upon a time for a name when we were trying to open the store. And so the idea that we came across was the owl wanders because it's the bird of wisdom, and it's trying to find things, the practices, the items, the things of beauty that people need to further their spiritual path, and it brings them back. And so that's kind of the whole genesis of the Wandering Owl's name.
I like it. And, this store, and you have a new address. I was listening to one of your podcasts, and now you actually have a house rather than a storefront. So that sounds
exactly. Yeah, we moved out of it. We had an old, a little storefront that we were in a building that we were renting, and then we had the opportunity to we're going in and we're making this home into the store space. It'll have the store up front and classroom and teaching space in the back, and we've got a little bit of green space now where we do rituals right on site and that sort of thing. So it's working really well for us.
That was the thing that impressed me most when you mentioned the house. I just had this impression of a really neat little quaint house and the store in there. And then when you said you had the green space back there and stuff, I went, okay, that's perfect. There you go. Sold, done deal. You've got lots of goodies at the shop, like Coventry candles, which everybody knows Coventry candles. There's stones, there's crystals, you've got herbs, oil, incense, jewelry, books, tarot stuff, divination things. I mean, it's relatively endless, isn't it? Kind of inventory.
It kind of, we're not a huge store. I will say that people sometimes get deceived because they come in and they're thinking that we are a much larger place because of the presence that we have online. I'll tell you what really sets us apart from a lot of places, and we do have some really nice stuff, and we really try to get some things that are locally crafted, so they're just things that you can't find anywhere else. But what really, I think, separates us is the whole community aspect of it. And this is no lie. I have people that will drive over an hour. They come from the other side of Toledo for our meetings. I have people come all the way from Flint, from Detroit, from Grand Rapids to attend our classes. I have people regularly come from Ann Arbor and Lansing because they want me to do a shamanic cleansing on them or some sort of ritual. And, really that's the best part and the most beautiful part about the Wandering Owl is, as I said, a shaman serves their community, and that is directly the hub of our community. That's where people come to find me so I can help them do this work.
And yeah, for a small store, I mean, you do classes, you do workshops, and you do some very special services that you perform, like shamanic life coaching and shamanic cleansing and house cleansing, wedding, funeral, change of life ceremonies. And I want to hear about the Peruvian fire and let me see if I can get it right, Heyriska ceremonies?
Ayahuasca.
I wasn't even close. Yeah. All right.
Hayawarakuri, I guess, is the technical name. It's called a despacho for most practical purposes. Despacho or Hayawarakui is the big ceremony in Peru, right? So what they'll do is they are this beautiful prayer ceremony, but it is so involved. It involves putting down cloths and papers, and you're using tons of sacred coca, and you're using food offerings, and every single item that goes is blessed, and people are exchanging prayers with each other, and it is the ceremony in Peru. I mean, if you're starting a business, that's what you do. You do a despacho. If you're having a new child, if you're looking for a job, I mean, no matter what the circumstance, a despacho ceremony is the thing that you turn to. So that's one nice one that I offer. And we kind of do the North American versions of them, I should say, because each one is different to each individual practitioner. There's a lot of, you can get these really awesome kits that come all the way up from Peru, and I use those as well, and you get all kinds of cool little jungle seeds and stuff in there. And then you can use ones that are like, ones that are reflective of Michigan here, so things that I would find in this area, and we just kind of tailor them. Each one is individual and unique. And then the Peruvian fire ceremony is the other one that I absolutely love doing, because it's a ritual of exchange. You are using sticks in a fire to take those things that are heavy for you, they're burdens for you, and you're giving those to Mother Earth so she can use them. And because they're not heavy for her, but she recycles them, she composts them, and then she gives you back instantly, right there in the boundaries of the ceremony, energy that you need. And man, I'll tell you what, I've had some stuff come out of those fire ceremonies. I've seen wedding, marriage proposals come out of it. I've seen new job offers come out of them. I've seen people who heal at a much faster rate than their doctors thought was possible. I've just seen some amazing things come from those fire ceremonies. So I love doing those.
So what, people, you do them as people request them for themselves, or is
exactly. Yeah. So like for a fire ceremony, I can do one for just one or two people, or I can do them for a larger group. I can come in, because I do them at Michigan Pagan Fest and a few other places, so I know I can do them up to 60, 70 people, and I can do them, scale them all the way down to just one or two people. So it all depends on what the needs are. And sometimes people are just doing them as a celebration or a touch point, and other times they really need some sort of change or transformation. And so that's when they can come to me. And that's, like you said, that's not the only thing I can do. We can do journey work and soul retrieval. The life coaching is really popular, because that is one of those things where we'll sit down and we'll take the time and we'll talk about what your goals are, and I'll show you techniques and I'll walk you through the process, and we'll check in on with you every couple weeks to a month, and we'll just keep working that process until you start getting in your life where you want to go.
Let's talk about soul retrieval for a minute, because some people that have just heard that are probably going, what are you doing? So why don't you explain what that really is? It just sounds a little scarier than it is, but yeah. Yeah,
soul retrieval. So like anytime that there's a traumatic event in somebody's life, someone dies unexpectedly, a car wreck. Now, some of the different texts and practitioners will tell you, it can even be something as minor as getting startled by somebody. So we could do these outside of haunted houses around Halloween time, I guess. But the theory is that if you are traumatized, that a part of your soul breaks off, that it becomes stuck in a closed cycle of that trauma, where it's reliving that trauma over and over and over and over again. And so the soul retrieval process is taking that soul fragment and cleansing it and healing it, and then helping it reintegrate into the rest of your soul body.
Well, by that definition alone, I think all of us need that, because, throughout life you have those things, and there are times that you do feel like something's being ripped from you, and you feel empty, or you feel that you can't get it back.
Yep.
Do you suggest that people do this? Maybe not regularly, but every so often, even if they don't, like, nothing recent has happened, just maybe something in the past that would help improve the life today.
That falls in the category of maybe. So the thing about soul retrievals is they're very popular when you look up shamanism online. The question I always have is, how often are they really needed? Most people actually you develop your own little rituals, your own ways of healing. Most people reintegrate those themselves over a little bit of time. It's only when something becomes really stuck that you might need outside help. And for that, the truth is that nobody knows for sure until they start doing the work on it. And when I say doing the work on it, I mean, if you were to come to ask me if you needed soul retrieval, I'd have to hear about all the circumstance. I'd do a basic cleansing on you and see if that made circumstance change. And while we were waiting to see if a basic cleansing changed circumstance, I would start turning into divination. Divination was a huge part of the shamanic tool set. Nobody did anything without doing divination first, and so that's exactly where I'd turn. And then I'd start turning to my guides and my allies and saying, "What do you think? What do you think?" And it's like a diagnostic process. It'd be like, it's the equivalent of someone with WebMD running into the doctor's office and demanding surgery. And, the surgeon might probably want to run some x-rays and stuff first.
Yeah, might want to do a little test. Yeah, and people in general, there are a lot of people that hear something and they all right, it's like diagnosing. If you pick up the Merck manual, for example, and start looking at diseases, 9 times out of 10, you've probably going to say you've had that one or you have that one, no matter what, because so many symptoms are very similar. And probably the same way with this too. You read something, you feel something, you hear about it, and then you think you need it. So just having the idea there, and then sometimes people just want to do things because it's something interesting or different.
Right.
But I'm not sure when people are asking for a soul retrieval or a reading of some kind or asking for help and don't really need it, I'm not very sure that what they get is anything that would make a difference, because you can't play with spirit. You can't just say, well, okay, I'm here. It's a dog and pony show. Let's do something. They're not going to react well unless you really need them for something, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And not only that, but people get it in their head what they think they want. Like, they might want a huge ceremony with a sweat lodge or this or that or the other thing. And, you might come to me, and even after divination and talking to my guides, my answer might be, okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of copal, and I'm going to give you a little of this herb and that herb, and you're going to go out and get a bunch of white flowers, and you're going to take a bath, and you're going to wear nothing but white for 4 days. And they're like, well, that doesn't sound like nearly as much fun. And I was like, from my perspective, it's like, do you want to be healed or do you want to have fun? Is this an adventure? Yeah. Is it a roller coaster ride, or is this something that you really need?
And I think that's what we deal with a lot, because it is a big unknown. I mean, the world that we live in isn't everybody's world. We're not mainstream. And so for people trying to understand things, some things just do sound like a lot of fun, and let's try this and let's do that. And it's hard to explain to people. As you were talking earlier about the different layers of the onion, to understand who we are, and I'm talking about pagans in general, and what we do, you have to start peeling those layers away. You have to understand and learn. You can't just decide that this is what it is or what it isn't. It's all about education. It's all about asking questions, and the right questions, and it's all about learning. And I think this is sometimes where we get into a lot of trouble with people, because they're so set in their ways. And, well, what you mean? You can't talk to my great aunt Susan? I mean,
exactly.
She's got to be right there with you, or stuff like that. They don't understand the way it works, and so I'm sure that you have a lot of trouble in this, like we all do, because it's and that's why we do the shows, or at least that's why I do my show.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
people can learn and open up and understand. And again, you don't have to jump in with both feet, but it's good to listen.
Well,
It's
from my
yeah. Go ahead.
perspective, shamanism teaches us every single tradition I've ever studied, and every tradition of shamanism is the same. Not all spirits have your best interests at heart.
That's right.
And when you start stepping into some of these processes, like, it sounds fabulous to be a shaman or to do a shamanic practice or a shamanic retreat or something when you're reading around it. There is an attrition level. There are people that die unnaturally young. There's people that get broken. There are broken toys all over the place where people think they know what they're doing or they think they want to do it for the wrong reasons. And things go wrong. And I think it doesn't take a lot of looking around to see that person that's walking around with a blank look in their face, or they've got all kinds of medical problems, or they're doing something really wacky, like, walking around with a half pound of bacon strapped to their forehead because the spirits told them to. And, these things have repercussions. It's not a game.
No.
Any general rule of thumb, anybody that wants to be a shaman probably shouldn't be. Because just for that reason.
Well, it's the same thing goes for witches. It's a calling. It's not something that you do because it's cool, or it sounds interesting. I mean, it's like being a writer too. Writers don't want to write. We have to write. Witches don't do what we do, but we have to do it, and neither do you. And that's kind of the way it works. And it's kind of difficult to convince people otherwise, because some people, it's really cool to be a shaman. Oh my God, you're a witch. Oh my God, how cool is that? But then I get on my soapbox about labels.
Right.
So, it's like, no, I'm human first, and, deal with me on that level. And then, this is first I'm human, and then, I just happen to be a witch. You're human, just happen to be a shaman.
Yeah, shaman is really it's a great example of that too, because in a lot of the stuff, it's become that kind of sexy word. I'm a shaman. And so like a lot of those that are practicing shamanism, I've got to tell you, I use the name Shaman Jim so reluctantly. I mean, the spirits literally had to call me that in such an audible way in the middle of a ritual that I couldn't ignore it in order for me to start using it. I didn't want to, and I still, to a large degree, don't want to use that term for myself. And it's kind of crazy how that there's so many people that just love that term, and they can't wait to start using it for themselves. And it's kind of scary in a way.
It's very reverent. I mean, like people that call themselves a witch, that's not very good for the mainstream. Shaman is kind of held up there a little bit higher.
It is.
Because, you're not accused of eating children and things. But still, a label is not a bad thing. I mean, it's not a good thing. Because if you label somebody the first time, you're never going to lose that label. And you're not going to get to know who's underneath that label. And, I think a lot of labels are egocentric, too. You slap a label on yourself to make yourself feel more important. And it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I got another question from chat that goes back to what we were talking about before, but time is running short, so I want to jump back there. We were talking about the Great Lakes. And Moof sent a question. She says, can you feel the lakes hurting?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, the Great Lakes are terribly powerful beings. But right now, especially for a couple of them, there is really a big tinge of sadness to them. And it's just because we're not treating them very well. We're not treating them reverently. We're just not paying attention. And especially now, because the overall message that we're getting from every corner of the spiritual world is about how important things like water are. We are trading away clean water for, as much as I love this show, I'd give it up for, my show, I'd give it up in a minute if it meant that we could really make a fundamental change on how the world consumes things. And so here we have the largest bodies of fresh water in the world, and we don't respect them. We don't love them like we should.
Well, and I was talking to someone earlier today about, the hurricanes and the storms on the East Coast and everything, and I said, I said, Mother Nature is on a rampage because we have ruined her world. And now she's finally got back. You know, there was the thing in New Zealand, that big earthquake today, and the tsunami warnings, and Florida's in a pickle, and so is the East Coast. Well, you know, this isn't happenstance. I'm pretty sure it isn't. You know, people say, well, there is no Mother Earth, there is no Gaia. Well, you know, that's a whole nother show. But she's kicking back because we've spent, you know, in our technological age, we have spent the last 100 years or so kind of ruining the planet. And it has to talk back. It has to react back. And it's unfortunate because maybe 100 years ago, we're not the ones that did it, but we may be continuing it in some ways because that's the way we know things. And so, yeah, it's a real pickle.
Well, and people don't realize, like, when you're looking at the larger spirits, like the mountains, like the lakes, like the rivers, the Mississippi and the Amazon and that sort of thing, a lot of those things are going to go, especially Mother Earth herself, is going to go happily on without us. But the sad part is we're destroying ourselves and we're destroying so many other life forms with us. But when it comes down to it, it's going to be like, you know, I think about it from the perspective of Mother Earth, from Pachamama's standpoint. What happens if you as a mother are watching your children just totally destroy yourself and they won't listen? You're still going to be there even after they've destroyed themselves. But how sad a process is that? You don't want that for your children.
Exactly. That's exactly what's going on. And what's going on really quickly now is the time. So
yeah, I know. This has been a real fast hour, hasn't it?
Yeah, so I'm inviting you back for another time. We'll have another go around, more questions. But in the meantime, tell everybody where they can find the show and where they can find you.
Well, you can find me at The Wandering Owl, thewanderingowl.com. You can always find me, James at the Owl is my Twitter feed. And you can email me, Jim at thewanderingowl.com, or Jim at thejaguarandtheowl.com. And my show, The Jaguar and the Owl, is every other Tuesday, 8 p.m. Eastern here on Para X. And for people who are interested, you can pick up old archives of that show at thejaguarandtheowl.com.
Perfect. And that's where I found you. So we're all good to go there. All right. Well, thank you. This was, like I said, a quick hour, an interesting hour. Not enough time, but we'll do it again. And,
sounds good.
Do come back, and I want to thank everybody for listening in tonight. And until next time, everybody, blessed be, and merry meet again. Good night.
This has been another edition of Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks. Be sure to tune in next week at this same time for another great guest and more cauldron stirring. Any rebroadcast or other use of this program without explicit permission is strictly prohibited. Copyright 2014. Moonlight Hall by Kevin MacLeod, licensed through Incompetech.com.